They say money can't buy happiness, but it certainly buys a comfortable illusion of it. For me, Henry Alden, that illusion was my birthright. Born into a family where wealth and power weren't just privileges but expectations, I grew up surrounded by the kind of opulence most people only dream about. My father, Richard Alden, was the epitome of success, a self-made man who built an empire of international businesses with his bare hands and an unshakable will. My mother, Evelyn, was the perfect counterpart, elegant, poised, and unwavering in her role as the matriarch of the Alden dynasty. Our home was a sprawling estate perched on the cliffs of Cape Elizabeth, where the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, like a promise of more power and influence. Marble floors gleamed underfoot, and every room was a masterpiece of modern architecture and timeless luxury. I had everything a child could want: designer toys, the best tutors, and even a personal driver by the time I turned 16. Yet, in the quiet moments when the grandeur seemed to echo louder than my own thoughts, I often wondered if this was all there was to life. "Henry!" My father's voice boomed one evening as we sat in the grand dining hall, its vaulted ceilings making his words reverberate like a commandment. "You're not a child anymore. You need to start thinking about your role in the family business." I nodded dutifully, the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. My role. My destiny. There was no room for deviation, no consideration of what I might want. Not that I had any strong desires. I was a leaf carried by the winds of expectation, drifting aimlessly but comfortably. By the time I entered university, I had mastered the art of going through the motions. Academics came easily to me, not because I was particularly brilliant, but because failure wasn't an option. My professors knew my last name, and that alone seemed to guarantee success. My social life was a parade of fleeting encounters and shallow connections. I didn't mind. Love was a game for those who had time to play, and I had no interest in risking my carefully orchestrated life for something as unpredictable as emotions. But then came Eleonore. We met at a charity gala, one of those events where everyone dressed to impress and pretended to care about causes they couldn't name. She wasn't like the other women I had dated. Eleonore was a force of nature, wild, untamed, and unapologetically herself. Her laughter rang out across the room, drawing eyes and turning heads. Her fiery red hair, cascading in loose waves, seemed to mirror her personality, unpredictable and captivating. She caught me staring and didn't blush or look away like others might. Instead, she sauntered over, a glass of champagne in one hand and a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "Enjoying the view?" she asked, her voice laced with both challenge and invitation. "I was," I replied, matching her smirk. "But it seems the view has decided to approach me." She laughed, the kind of laugh that made you feel like you were in on a secret. "Henry Alden, right? The prince of this kingdom?" Her words were teasing, but there was an edge to them, as if she was daring me to prove I was more than just my name. "And you are?" I asked, intrigued. "Eleonore. Just Eleonore." Her eyes sparkled as if she relished the mystery. Our relationship was a whirlwind, as fiery and intense as Eleonore herself. She challenged me in ways no one else had. Where others bent to the Alden name, she pushed back. She made me feel alive, like I was stepping out of the shadows of my father's expectations and into the light of something real. But even then, there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place, an edge of recklessness that made me both exhilarated and uneasy. Looking back, I realize how blind I was to the warning signs. Love, or what I thought was love, had a way of clouding my judgment. Eleonore was a storm, and I was a man who had never learned to swim. But in those early days, drowning didn't seem so bad. One night, as we sat on the balcony of my penthouse overlooking the city, Eleonore turned to me with a look that was both playful and serious. "Henry, do you ever feel trapped?" she asked, swirling her wine glass lazily. "Trapped?" I echoed, caught off guard. "Yeah. Like your whole life has been decided for you, and you're just playing a role someone else wrote." I thought about it, the question lingering in the cool night air. "Maybe," I admitted. "But isn't that just how life works? We all have roles to play." She shook her head, her hair catching the light of the city skyline. Not me. I write my own script. Always have, always will. In those days I admired her defiance, her refusal to be confined. It was a quality I lacked but yearned for. I didn't know then that Eleonore's script would eventually write us into chaos. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake her words. For the first time, I wondered if my golden cage was worth the price I was paying. But those thoughts were fleeting. After all, I had everything a man could want, or so I thought. Love, or what I believed was love, had a way of engulfing me completely, like a wildfire that spread too fast to control. Eleonore was the flame, and I was drawn to her light despite the heat that burned. I had been cautious with women before her, keeping them at a safe distance, but Eleonore was different. She wasn't the type to be kept at arm's length. She had a way of pulling you in, making you feel like the world revolved around her, and for a while, mine did. It was on a crisp autumn evening, shortly after we had started dating, that Eleonore and I found ourselves walking through Central Park. The leaves crunched beneath our feet, golden auburn like her hair, and the city hummed in the background, a low and distant melody. "Tell me something about you that no one else knows," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I don't know if there's anything left to tell," I replied. "My life's always been an open book, for better or worse." She stopped and turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. "Don't give me that. Everyone has secrets. Even golden boys like you." Golden boy. It was what she often called me, both in endearment and in accusation. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "All right," I said. "When I was 12, I wanted to be an astronaut. Spent the whole summer convincing my parents to let me go to space camp." She laughed, a sound that echoed like a bell in the crisp air. "An astronaut? Let me guess, they talked you out of it?" I nodded, my smile fading. "Said it wasn't practical. That my future was here, in the family business." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That's the problem with people like you," she said finally. "You let everyone else decide your life for you." Her words stung, though I didn't fully understand why. I had never questioned the life that was laid out for me, not until I met her. And maybe that was part of her appeal. She made me see the cracks in the gilded cage I had lived in for so long. Our relationship moved quickly after that. Eleonore had a way of making everything seem urgent, as if life was too short to waste time. She pushed me to step outside my comfort zone, to take risks I would have never considered before. One night, she convinced me to sneak into an art gallery after hours. It was the kind of thing I would have dismissed as reckless and unnecessary before her, but with Eleonore, it felt exhilarating. "Come on, Henry," she whispered, tugging on my hand as we slipped through an unlocked side door. "Live a little." The gallery was silent, the moonlight streaming through the high windows casting shadows on the polished floors. Eleonore moved through the space like she belonged there, her fingers brushing against the edges of the frames. "This," she said, stopping in front of a painting of a stormy sea, "is what life should feel like." "A shipwreck?" I teased. "No," she said, her voice serious. "The thrill of being in the storm. The chaos, the danger, the possibility of something extraordinary." Her words struck a chord in me, though I couldn't fully articulate why. I had spent my entire life avoiding storms, steering clear of anything that might disrupt the smooth trajectory of my future. But with Eleonore, I found myself craving the chaos she promised. A few months later, Eleonore dropped a bombshell that would change everything. We were sitting in my penthouse, the city lights stretching out below us like a sea of stars. She was unusually quiet that night, her playful energy replaced by something heavier. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my glass of scotch. She looked at me, her eyes darker than usual. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady but devoid of the excitement I had expected. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to feel: shock, joy, fear? All of it hit me at once, a tidal wave of emotions I couldn't process. "Pregnant?" I repeated, as if saying the word would make it real. Yes, she said, crossing her arms. And before you ask, yes, it's yours. Her tone was defensive, as if she expected me to doubt her. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Eleonore, I said softly, this is incredible. Unexpected, but incredible. Incredible? She said, her voice laced with disbelief. This isn't some fairy tale, Henry. A baby changes everything. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. A baby did change everything. It wasn't just about me and Eleonore anymore. It was about the life we had created together. And as terrifying as that thought was, it also filled me with a strange sense of purpose. The wedding came quickly after that, a grand affair orchestrated by my parents. Eleonore seemed indifferent to the pomp and circumstance, her fiery spirit dulled by the weight of our new reality. I hoped that marriage would bring us closer, that the arrival of our child would unite us in a way nothing else could. But even then, there were moments when I wondered if I had made a mistake. Eleonore was a storm, and I had willingly walked into the eye of it, not realizing that the calm at the center was only temporary. Kathryn arrived on a cold February morning, her cries piercing the sterile stillness of the hospital room like a symphony announcing her arrival. I remember staring at her tiny, scrunched-up face and feeling a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked me off my feet. She was perfect, small and fragile but radiating an undeniable strength. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to truly love someone unconditionally. Eleonore, on the other hand, seemed detached. She held Kathryn briefly, smiled for the obligatory family photos, and then handed her back to the nurse without a second glance. "She's lovely," Eleonore said with a casualness that stung. "But I'm exhausted. Can you handle things for a while?" It wasn't a question, it was a dismissal. And so began the dynamic that would define our family. I became the parent, and Eleonore became, well, Eleonore. From the very beginning, Kathryn was my world. Her first smile, her first laugh, the way her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, it all felt like magic. She had this light about her, a warmth that seemed to fill every corner of my heart. I would sit by her crib for hours, watching her sleep, marveling at the rise and fall of her chest, the peacefulness of her expression. "She's got your eyes," my mother said one afternoon as she visited to meet her granddaughter. She looked at me with a rare softness, a fleeting moment of vulnerability. "You were like that once, so full of wonder." I smiled but didn't respond. Kathryn wasn't just a reflection of me, she was my hope, my redemption. She was everything I didn't know I needed. Eleonore, meanwhile, seemed to view motherhood as an inconvenience. She resumed her social life within weeks of Kathryn's birth, attending galas and charity events, as if nothing had changed. "I can't just sit around all day," she said one evening as she applied her lipstick in front of the mirror. "You have no idea how suffocating it is." I looked up from the bottle I was preparing for Kathryn, who was fussing in my arms. "Suffocating? Eleonore, this is your daughter we're talking about." She rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically. "Henry, I'm not built for this. I need my freedom. Kathryn has you, she's fine." Her words cut me deeply, but I didn't argue. It wasn't worth it. I had learned by then that Eleonore would always choose herself first. Despite Eleonore's absence, Kathryn thrived. She was a curious, vibrant child, always exploring, always smiling. Her laughter was infectious, a sound that could melt even the coldest of days. She had a way of making everyone around her feel special, like they were the most important person in the world. "Daddy," she said one evening as we sat on the floor of the living room, building a tower out of blocks, "why doesn't Mommy play with us?" The question caught me off guard. I searched her innocent blue eyes, trying to find the right words. "Mommy loves you very much, sweetheart," I said finally. "She just has other things she needs to do." Kathryn frowned but didn't press further. She simply nodded and returned to stacking the blocks, her small hands carefully placing each one with precision. It broke my heart to see her accept it so easily, to see her learn so young that love from some people could be conditional. As the months turned into years, my bond with Kathryn grew stronger. I became her everything, her protector, her playmate, her confidant. We had our routines: pancake breakfasts on Saturday mornings, storytime before bed, trips to the park where she insisted on feeding the ducks even if they weren't hungry. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she reached up and touched my face with her tiny hand. "You're the best daddy in the whole world," she said, her voice soft and sleepy. I felt a lump rise in my throat. "And you're the best daughter in the whole world," I replied, kissing her forehead. "Good night, my little star." Eleonore's presence in Kathryn's life became increasingly sporadic. She would appear for special occasions, playing the part of the doting mother for the benefit of our social circle, but Kathryn saw through it. Children have a way of sensing when love is insincere. One Christmas, Eleonore arrived late to the family dinner, breezing in with an air of indifference. Kathryn, who had been eagerly waiting to show her the ornaments we had made together, ran up to her with a glitter-covered star. "Look, Mommy," she said, holding it up proudly. "I made this for the tree." Eleonore glanced at it briefly before handing it back. "That's lovely, darling," she said absent-mindedly, already distracted by a conversation with one of my cousins. Kathryn's face fell, and my heart broke. I pulled her into a hug and whispered, "It's the most beautiful star I've ever seen. Let's put it right at the top." Her smile returned, and I carried her over to the tree, lifting her so she could place the ornament on the highest branch. In that moment, I realized something that had been forming in the back of my mind for a while. I would do anything to protect her from feeling unloved. Anything. Eleonore's coldness didn't change. If anything, it deepened. She seemed to see Kathryn not as a person but as an obligation, a part of the life she had never truly wanted. And while her distance hurt, it also solidified my resolve. Kathryn was my daughter, my light, my reason for everything. I didn't need Eleonore's approval or partnership. I had Kathryn, and she had me. Together, we would weather any storm. I was determined to ensure that, no matter what happened, she would never doubt how deeply she was loved. As the years passed, the cracks in my marriage to Eleonore deepened, spreading like fissures through the fragile veneer of our life together. At first, I tried to ignore them. After all, I had Kathryn, and in her, I found a love that felt pure and unwavering. But even the strongest walls can't hold back a rising tide forever. Eleonore and I had become strangers in our own home. She lived her life as if Kathryn and I were afterthoughts, flitting from one glamorous event to the next. Her phone was always buzzing with invitations, her calendar filled with charity galas, exclusive dinners, and luxury trips. The rare moments she spent at home were marked by an icy detachment that chilled the air. One evening, after putting Kathryn to bed, I found Eleonore in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa with a glass of wine in hand. The flickering light of the fireplace cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her beauty. "Do you even want to be here?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. She looked up, startled, then sighed as if I had asked her to do something inconvenient. "What kind of question is that, Henry?" "A serious one," I replied, stepping closer. "You're barely here. Kathryn barely sees you. And when you are home, it's like you're somewhere else entirely." She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I didn't sign up for this, Henry. The husband, the kid, the suburban family life. It's suffocating. You didn't sign up for this?" My voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "Eleonore, you're her mother. You don't just sign up for that, you are that. And as for me, I didn't sign up for a wife who cares more about parties than her own daughter." She stood abruptly, her wine sloshing in the glass. "Don't lecture me, Henry. You knew who I was when we got married. Don't pretend you didn't." "Who you were?" I repeated, my tone bitter. "I thought I married someone who cared about family, about building a life together. But all you care about is yourself." Her laugh was sharp and cold, like shattered glass. "Spare me the sanctimony. You only married me because your parents wanted it. I was just another box for you to check." The accusation stung, not because it was entirely false, but because it exposed a truth I wasn't ready to confront. I had married Eleonore because it seemed like the right thing to do, the expected thing. But I had also believed, hoped, that we could build something real together. That hope now felt like a cruel joke. Our arguments became more frequent after that. Small disagreements would erupt into full-blown fights, our voices echoing through the house like thunder. Kathryn would sometimes peek out from her room, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. One night, after a particularly heated argument, she came to my room clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "Daddy, why are you and Mommy always yelling?" she asked, her voice trembling. I knelt down to her level and pulled her into a hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Mommy and we just don't always see things the same way. But none of this is your fault. You know that, right?" She nodded against my shoulder, but her tears soaked through my shirt. In that moment, I felt a surge of guilt and determination. Kathryn deserved better than this. She deserved a home filled with love, not conflict. Despite my efforts to shield her from the tension, Kathryn began to sense the growing distance between her parents. She stopped asking for her mother's attention, instead turning to me for comfort and companionship. I tried to fill the void as best I could, but it wasn't always enough. One afternoon, as we sat together painting in the backyard, Kathryn looked up at me with a question that broke my heart. "Daddy, does Mommy love me?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I set down my brush and pulled her onto my lap. "Of course she does," I said, forcing a smile. "She just shows it in different ways." Kathryn studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if trying to believe me. But the doubt lingered in her eyes, a shadow that I couldn't erase. Eleonore's indifference began to bleed into every aspect of our lives. She missed parent-teacher conferences, skipped birthday parties, and brushed off the milestones that meant the world to me and Kathryn. When I confronted her about it, she dismissed me with the same infuriating nonchalance. "I'm not good at this domestic stuff, Henry," she said one night as she packed for yet another weekend trip. "It's just not who I am." "And what about Kathryn?" I demanded. "She needs her mother. She has you," Eleonore replied, zipping up her designer suitcase. "You're better at this parenting thing anyway." Her words were meant to absolve her of responsibility, but they only deepened the chasm between us. It wasn't just her absence that hurt, it was her refusal to even try. As the months dragged on, I began to wonder how much longer I could hold everything together. My love for Kathryn was the glue that kept me from falling apart, but even the strongest bonds have their limits. Eleonore was like a storm that never passed, a relentless force that threatened to erode everything I held dear. One night, as I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, I found myself staring at a framed photo of our family taken shortly after Kathryn was born. We looked so happy, so whole. But now, the image felt like a lie, a relic of a life that no longer existed. I ran a hand through my hair, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How had we ended up here? Was there any way to fix it? Or had Eleonore and I been doomed from the start, two mismatched souls bound by obligation rather than love? As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, I realized that something had to change. For Kathryn's sake, if not for my own, I couldn't keep living like this. The cracks had become too deep, and I could no longer ignore the truth. Our family was breaking, and no amount of pretending could hold it together. The night of our 5th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration. At least that's what I told myself as I straightened my tie in the gilded mirror of our bedroom. The party had been Eleonore's idea, a grand banquet with all the trappings of high society. It was as if she believed that a glittering facade could hide the cracks in our marriage. "Do you have to wear that tie?" Eleonore's voice floated from the bathroom, sharp and dismissive. "It makes you look so predictable." I glanced at my reflection and loosened the tie slightly, more out of habit than to appease her. "Predictable is what people expect at these events," I replied evenly. "Especially when they're Alden's." She emerged from the bathroom in a gown that shimmered like liquid gold, her fiery hair swept up into an elegant twist. She looked stunning, as always, but her beauty had taken on a sharpness over the years, a cold perfection that left no room for warmth. "Let's just get this over with," she said, brushing past me without so much as a glance. The venue was as extravagant as Eleonore had planned, a historic ballroom with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and walls adorned with cascading flowers. Guests mingled in their finest attire, their laughter and conversation filling the air. I smiled and nodded as I made my rounds, exchanging pleasantries with old acquaintances and business partners, but my mind was elsewhere. Eleonore, of course, was in her element. She moved through the crowd like a queen, her laughter ringing out as she charmed everyone in her orbit. I watched her from a distance, a glass of scotch in my hand, and wondered how we had become two people living entirely separate lives. "Henry, my boy," came a booming voice from behind me. It was Charles Wainwright, one of my father's oldest business associates. "Happy anniversary. 5 years, eh? Quite the milestone." I forced a smile and shook his hand. "Thank you, Charles. It's been an interesting journey." He chuckled and clapped me on the shoulder. "Marriage always is. But you've got a beautiful wife and a wonderful little girl. Count your blessings." I nodded, though his words felt hollow. If only he knew how fragile the foundation of our family truly was. It was halfway through the evening, during one of Eleonore's many dances with a different partner, that I noticed the envelope. It was perched on the edge of my glass at the table, inconspicuous but deliberate. I glanced around, searching for the person who had left it, but no one seemed to be paying attention. Curiosity got the better of me. I slid the envelope into my lap and opened it discreetly. Inside was a stack of photographs. My heart stopped as I flipped through them, each image more damning than the last. Eleonore, tangled in the arms of various men, in hotel rooms, private yachts, even in our own home. The explicit nature of the photos left no room for doubt. This wasn't gossip or conjecture, it was a brutal, undeniable truth. The room seemed to tilt around me, the laughter and music fading into a dull roar. My hands shook as I shoved the photos back into the envelope and tucked it into my jacket. My chest burned with a mix of rage, humiliation, and despair. I had known things were bad between us, but this was a betrayal beyond anything I had imagined. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I avoided Eleonore as much as possible, focusing on keeping up appearances for the sake of our guests. Inside, I was seething, a storm of emotions threatening to erupt. When the last of the guests finally left, I followed Eleonore into the car, the envelope burning a hole in my pocket. She was scrolling through her phone, oblivious to my tension. "Well, that went well, don't you think?" she said casually. I stared at her, incredulous. "You have no shame, do you?" She looked up, frowning. "What's that supposed to mean?" I reached into my pocket and threw the envelope onto the seat between us. "Open it," I said coldly. Her eyes narrowed, but she complied. As she flipped through the photos, her expression didn't change. No shock, no guilt, no apology. Just a slight arch of her eyebrow, as if she were examining a mildly interesting piece of art. "Well," she said finally, closing the envelope and setting it aside. "I guess the cat's out of the bag." I stared at her, speechless. "That's all you have to say?" She shrugged. "What do you want me to say, Henry? That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? You and I both know this marriage hasn't been real for a long time." Her casual indifference was like a dagger to my chest. "We have a daughter, Eleonore. A family. Does that mean nothing to you?" She laughed bitterly. "A family? Don't kid yourself. The only thing keeping us together is convenience. And as for Kathryn," she hesitated, her smile turning cruel. "Well, she's not even yours." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," she said, her tone venomous. "Kathryn isn't your daughter. You're just a convenient stand-in." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to collapse around me, everything I had believed shattered in an instant. But then, something inside me hardened. I clenched my fists, my voice steady but cold. "It doesn't matter," I said. "She's my daughter, no matter what your twisted games have done. I will fight for her. I will protect her from you." Eleonore smirked. "Good luck with that." The car pulled into the driveway, and I got out without another word. Inside, I went straight to Kathryn's room, where she lay asleep, her small hand clutching her favorite stuffed bear. I knelt by her bed, tears streaming down my face as I stroked her hair. "You're mine," I whispered, my voice breaking. "No one can take you away from me." In that moment, I made a vow. No matter what it took, no matter what I had to sacrifice, I would ensure Kathryn's happiness and safety. She was my light, my anchor, and I wouldn't let Eleonore's darkness consume her. The days following Eleonore's revelation were a blur. I moved through life as if on autopilot, my mind reeling from the weight of her betrayal. The photographs had been damning enough, but her casual declaration that Kathryn wasn't my daughter had broken something deep within me. It wasn't just a loss of trust, it was the realization that my entire marriage had been a carefully constructed lie. But one thing remained clear to me: Kathryn was my daughter. She had been from the moment she was born, and no cruel words from Eleonore could change that. The morning after the anniversary banquet, I called my lawyer. Thomas Grayson was an old friend of my father's and one of the sharpest legal minds in the city. He arrived at my office within the hour, his usual air of confidence tempered by concern. "What's going on, Henry?" he asked as he settled into the chair across from me. I slid the envelope across the desk. "This." He opened it and flipped through the photos, his expression darkening with each one. "Jesus," he muttered. "And you're sure there's no mistake?" "She admitted to it," I said, my voice cold. "She doesn't even care. And that's not the worst of it." Thomas looked up, his brow furrowed. "What could be worse than this? She says Kathryn isn't mine?" The words felt like poison on my tongue, but saying them aloud only strengthened my resolve. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Have you considered a paternity test?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "I don't need one. Kathryn is mine. I don't care what any test says." Thomas nodded slowly. "Understood. So, what's the plan?" "I want a divorce," I said firmly. "And I want full custody of Kathryn. Eleonore can take whatever settlement she wants, but she's not taking my daughter." Thomas tapped his pen against the desk, his sharp mind already at work. "It won't be easy, Henry. If she decides to fight for custody, the court might consider her claim about Kathryn's paternity. Then make sure she doesn't fight," I said. "Offer her whatever it takes. Just get her out of our lives." That evening, I confronted Eleonore. She was in the sitting room, scrolling through her phone as if the previous night's chaos had never happened. When I walked in, she glanced up briefly, her expression bored. "Henry," she said, setting her phone aside. "You look serious. What now?" I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my anger in check. "I've spoken to my lawyer. We're getting a divorce." She smirked, unbothered. "Finally. I was wondering how long it would take you to grow a spine. I want full custody of Kathryn," I continued, ignoring her jab. "And I'm prepared to offer you a substantial settlement to make that happen." Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "You think you can just pay me off?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Yes," I said bluntly. "Because we both know you don't care about Kathryn. You care about the money, the lifestyle, the image. I'm offering you a way to walk away with all of that intact." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. "And what if I say no? What if I fight you for custody? Then we go to court," I said, meeting her gaze. "And I'll make sure every single one of these photos is presented as evidence. How do you think that will look to a judge?" Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. She wasn't used to being cornered, and the realization that I wasn't backing down seemed to unsettle her. "You bastard," she hissed, standing up. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Playing the perfect father while your precious daughter isn't even yours. Blood doesn't make a father," I said, my voice steady. "Love does. And you don't know the first thing about that. She glared at me, her face flushed with anger. But after a long, tense silence, she sank back into her chair and crossed her arms. Fine, she said finally. Give me the terms. The negotiation process was brutal, but in the end, Eleonore accepted the deal. She signed over full custody of Kathryn in exchange for a substantial financial settlement, and a guarantee that I wouldn't pursue legal action against her for infidelity. She also agreed to a non-disclosure clause, ensuring that her scandalous behavior wouldn't make its way into the tabloids. When the paperwork was finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Eleonore's departure marked the end of a chapter in my life, one filled with lies and pain, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter with Kathryn. On the day Eleonore moved out, Kathryn watched from the window as the movers loaded boxes into a sleek black car. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, but she sensed the gravity of the moment. "Where's Mommy going?" she asked, her voice small. I knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mommy needs to go away for a while," I said gently. "But I'm here, and I always will be." "Will she come back?" Kathryn asked, her wide blue eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Maybe one day," I said finally. "But for now, it's just you and me, kiddo." She nodded slowly, then leaned against me, her small hand clutching mine. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Kathryn was my light, my anchor, and I would do everything in my power to protect her from the shadows of the past. As Eleonore's car disappeared down the driveway, I scooped Kathryn into my arms and carried her upstairs. We spent the evening building puzzles and reading stories, the laughter and warmth of our bond filling the house. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The storm had passed, and though the damage was great, I knew we could rebuild. Kathryn and I had each other, and that was enough. Eleonore might have signed the papers and walked out of our lives, but her shadow lingered. Divorce doesn't end relationships, it reshapes them, twisting the threads of connection into something unrecognizable. And while I had full custody of Kathryn, Eleonore's absence brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. For Kathryn, the transition was confusing. She was too young to understand the complexities of what had happened, and despite her mother's neglect, she still held on to the idea of Eleonore as someone who loved her. "Daddy," she asked one evening as we sat in her room, piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, "why doesn't Mommy call anymore?" I paused, the puzzle piece in my hand suddenly feeling heavier than it should. "Mommy's busy, sweetheart," I said, forcing a gentle tone. "But you know she loves you." Kathryn tilted her head, her blue eyes scanning my face. "Then why did she leave?" Her question cut through me like a knife. How do you explain to a child that some people are incapable of giving love, even to their own family? I reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand," I said finally. "But what's important is that I'm here, and I'll always be here." She seemed to accept my answer, though the sadness in her eyes lingered. It was a look I'd grown used to seeing, a quiet longing for something, or someone, she didn't fully comprehend. Life settled into a new rhythm. Kathryn and I found joy in the simple routines of our days: pancake breakfasts on Saturdays, afternoon trips to the park, bedtime stories where her laughter filled the room. She became my purpose, my guiding light, and I poured all my energy into being the father she needed. But Eleonore wasn't entirely gone. She resurfaced in small, insidious ways, a headline in a gossip column, a fleeting mention from a mutual acquaintance. Each time, it felt like a reminder of the life I had tried to leave behind. Then, one day, she returned in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "We need to talk. It's about Eleonore." I called him immediately, my stomach twisting into knots. "What's going on?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "She's filed a petition to modify the custody agreement," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "She's asking for visitation rights." I gripped the phone tightly, my heart pounding. "She signed away her rights. She has no claim." She's arguing that she was coerced into the agreement, Thomas explained. She claims she didn't fully understand the consequences. Anger surged through me. She understood perfectly. She took the money and walked away without a second thought. I know, Henry, Thomas said, his tone soothing. But the court has to consider her petition. It's standard procedure. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady my thoughts. What do we do? We fight, Thomas said simply. And we make it clear that her actions don't warrant a second chance. The days leading up to the hearing were some of the most stressful of my life. I replayed every moment of my marriage to Eleonore, every instance of her neglect, every choice she made that put herself above Kathryn. But I also knew how skilled Eleonore was at manipulating people, at crafting a narrative that served her interests. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in a sharp suit and knelt by Kathryn's bed. She was still asleep, her face peaceful, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, my little star." The courtroom was cold and formal, the air heavy with tension. Eleonore sat across the aisle, her beauty as striking as ever. She wore a tailored dress, her hair perfectly styled, and her expression was one of practiced contrition. She looked every bit the picture of a mother seeking redemption. Her lawyer began with a polished opening statement, painting Eleonore as a woman who had made mistakes but was now ready to rebuild her relationship with her daughter. He spoke of her growth and her commitment to being a better parent. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and faced the judge, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't just about my rights as a father. It's about Kathryn's right to a stable, loving environment. For years, Eleonore prioritized her own desires over our family. She signed away her rights willingly, and Kathryn has thrived in her absence. Introducing her back into Kathryn's life now would do more harm than good." I presented evidence, the photographs, accounts of Eleonore's neglect, and the details of the custody agreement she had signed. My lawyer emphasized Kathryn's well-being, painting a clear picture of the life I had built for her, a life free of the chaos Eleonore had brought. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his words were clear and decisive. "While the court recognizes the importance of a child's relationship with both parents, it also prioritizes the child's stability and well-being. Given the evidence presented, the petition for visitation is denied." Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by a glance at Eleonore. She sat stiffly, her jaw clenched, her eyes cold. She had lost, but I knew she wasn't the type to let go easily. That evening, as I tucked Kathryn into bed, she reached up and touched my face, her tiny hand warm against my cheek. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft with sleep. "I love you more than anything, Kathryn," I said, my throat tightening. "Always." As I watched her drift off, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Eleonore might have been a storm in our lives, but storms pass. And in their wake, they leave a sky clearer than before. Kathryn and I had weathered the worst of it together, and for the first time, I felt certain that we could face whatever came next. Life after the court ruling felt lighter, like the oppressive weight that had pressed on my chest for years had finally lifted. The knowledge that Kathryn was safe from Eleonore's chaos gave me a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, I could focus entirely on building a life for my daughter, one filled with stability, love, and happiness. The first few weeks were an adjustment, but Kathryn seemed to adapt quickly. She was still young, and her world revolved around the constants in her life, school, her friends, and me. "Daddy," she said one Saturday morning as I flipped pancakes at the stove, "can we go to the park today?" I glanced over my shoulder and smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Anything you want." Her face lit up, and I couldn't help but marvel at how resilient she was. Despite everything she had been through, Kathryn's joy remained intact, a beacon of light in our lives. At the park, Kathryn ran to the swings, her laughter ringing out as I pushed her higher and higher. Watching her, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had become my reason for everything, my anchor in a world that often felt unsteady. "Higher, Daddy!" she squealed, her hair flying in the breeze. I laughed and gave the swing another push. "You're going to fly away if I push you any higher." As she soared through the air, her laughter blending with the sounds of children playing around us, I realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the grand gestures or extravagant parties Eleonore had always chased, but these simple, fleeting moments of pure connection. In the months that followed, Kathryn and I built a life that felt like ours. We turned small routines into cherished traditions: movie nights on Fridays, where we'd eat popcorn and watch animated films; Sunday afternoons spent baking cookies that usually ended with flour covering the kitchen and us laughing at the mess. I also began to reconnect with parts of myself I had forgotten. For so long, my identity had been tied to Eleonore and the life we had tried to build together. But now, without her shadow looming over us, I started to remember who I was, and who I wanted to be. One evening, as Kathryn worked on a drawing at the kitchen table, I sat nearby, reviewing paperwork for one of my father's companies. She looked up suddenly, her face thoughtful. "Daddy, are you happy?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. I set down my pen and studied her for a moment. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" She shrugged, her eyes focused on her drawing. "I just want you to be happy. Like me." My chest tightened with emotion. "I am happy," I said, and it was the truth. "Because I have you." She smiled, satisfied with my answer, and went back to her drawing. I watched her for a moment, marveling at how much love and wisdom could exist in someone so small. Despite the joy Kathryn brought into my life, there were still moments when the past crept in, shadows of Eleonore's betrayal, the pain of knowing that the family I had once dreamed of was never truly real. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by the warmth of new memories we were creating together. One evening, as I tucked Kathryn into bed, she handed me a drawing she had made earlier that day. It was a picture of the two of us standing under a bright sun, holding hands. "This is us, Daddy," she said, her voice soft with pride. "We're happy." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as I took the drawing. "It's beautiful, Kathryn. Just like you." She beamed, then snuggled under her blanket, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm. As I turned off the light and closed her door, I held the drawing close, feeling a swell of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm me. In the quiet moments, I often reflected on how far we had come. Kathryn had taught me that happiness isn't something you find, it's something you create. It's in the way she laughed when I read her favorite bedtime story, or the way she clung to my hand as we crossed the street. It's in the small, everyday acts of love that build a life worth living. Eleonore had tried to take so much from me, my dignity, my trust, my family, but she hadn't succeeded. Kathryn was my greatest gift, my greatest victory, and no one could ever take her away from me. One night, as I sat by the fire with a glass of scotch, I thought about the future. There was still so much uncertainty, so many challenges ahead, but I no longer felt afraid. I had Kathryn, and she had me, and together we could face anything. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the life we were building, a life filled with love, laughter, and the unshakable bond between a father and his daughter. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and Kathryn and I were at the park, our favorite escape. She was on the slide, laughing as she zoomed down and ran back up to the ladder to do it all over again. I sat on a bench nearby, sipping coffee and watching her, content in the simplicity of the moment. "Daddy, look!" she shouted, waving to me before sliding down again. "You're a rocket!" I called back, grinning as her giggles filled the air. For the past year, life had felt like a steady climb away from the wreckage Eleonore had left behind. Kathryn and I had built something solid and beautiful together, and I was finally beginning to feel whole again. But peace has a way of being disrupted, and that disruption came on a day I least expected it. That evening, as I was finishing the dishes, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and froze. The message was from an unknown number, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk. It's about Kathryn." Eleonore. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, my heart pounding. After everything, I had convinced myself that Eleonore was out of our lives for good. The custody battle had been a line in the sand, one I thought she'd never cross. But here she was, her presence seeping back into our lives like a shadow I couldn't escape. I deleted the message and turned off my phone, unwilling to let her disrupt the fragile peace I had worked so hard to create. But her words lingered, a dark cloud that followed me into the night. Over the next few days, Eleonore's message gnawed at me. I didn't respond, but the uncertainty of her intentions weighed heavily on my mind. I couldn't help but wonder what she wanted, what new chaos she was planning to unleash. "Daddy, are you okay?" Kathryn asked one evening as we worked on a puzzle together. I forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" She shrugged, her small hands carefully fitting two pieces together. "You look sad." I reached out and ruffled her hair. "I'm just thinking about work," I said, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. "Nothing for you to worry about." She nodded, accepting my answer, but her perceptiveness was a reminder of how much she noticed, even when I tried to hide things. I couldn't let Eleonore's reappearance affect Kathryn. I wouldn't let her disrupt the life we had built. A week later, Eleonore's shadow became flesh. I was picking Kathryn up from school, standing in the usual line of parents, when I saw her. Eleonore was leaning against a sleek black car across the street, her arms crossed and her sunglasses hiding her eyes. She looked as poised and composed as ever, but her presence sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. Kathryn spotted me and ran toward me, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders. "Daddy!" she called, her face lighting up with a smile. I scooped her into my arms and kissed her cheek. "How was school, my little star?" "Good," she said, wriggling out of my arms. "Can we get ice cream?" "Of course," I said, taking her hand. But as we walked to the car, I felt Eleonore's gaze burning into my back. "Henry!" she called, her voice sharp and commanding. I turned slowly, shielding Kathryn behind me. "What do you want, Eleonore?" She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were as cold as ever. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly. "You've made your choices, and Kathryn and I are doing just fine without you." Her gaze flicked to Kathryn, who was peeking out from behind me, her curiosity piqued. "Is that what you tell her? That I just disappeared?" "She doesn't need to know the truth," I said, my voice low. "You gave up your rights, Eleonore. You don't get to waltz back into her life now." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I'm not here to disrupt your little fantasy, Henry. I just want to see her." My chest tightened with anger. "You had your chance. You walked away. You don't get another one." Eleonore's expression softened slightly, a rare crack in her icy exterior. "I made mistakes," she said, almost whispering. "But she's my daughter, Henry. I have a right to know her." "No," I said sharply. "You lost that right when you abandoned her." Kathryn tugged on my hand, her voice breaking the tension. "Daddy, who's that?" I crouched down to her level, keeping my tone gentle. "Just someone Daddy used to know, sweetheart. Let's go get that ice cream." As we walked away, I could feel Eleonore watching us, her presence like a weight pressing on my back. But I didn't look back. I wouldn't let her drag us back into the chaos she had created. That night, as I tucked Kathryn into bed, I kissed her forehead and held her a little longer than usual. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, my little star," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "More than anything in the world." As I sat alone in the living room later that night, I realized that Eleonore's reappearance wasn't just a disruption, it was a test. A test of my resolve, of my commitment to Kathryn, and of my ability to protect the life we had built. I didn't know what Eleonore's next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain: I would do whatever it took to keep Kathryn safe. She was my light, my purpose, and I wouldn't let anyone, not even her mother, dim that light. The morning after my encounter with Eleonore, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The world outside was gray and cold, but inside, the house was warm and filled with the faint hum of life, Kathryn's soft footsteps padding down the hall, the cheerful whistle of the coffee machine. I couldn't shake the heaviness Eleonore's return had left in its wake. She was like a storm cloud hovering just beyond the horizon, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she struck again. Later that day, while Kathryn was at school, I met with Thomas in his office. The room was lined with bookshelves and smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on me as I explained what had happened. "She's not going to stop," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "She wants back in, and she thinks she has a right to Kathryn." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Legally, she has no claim. The custody agreement is ironclad. But emotionally, this could get messy. Kathryn is at an age where she's starting to ask questions, and Eleonore could use that to her advantage." I rubbed my temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "I can't let her back into Kathryn's life, Thomas. She's a danger to her stability, to her happiness." "Then we need to be proactive," Thomas said. "If Eleonore continues to push, we can file for a restraining order. But the most important thing is to be honest with Kathryn, at least in a way she can understand. If Eleonore does manage to contact her, she needs to know the truth." The thought of explaining Eleonore's absence to Kathryn made my stomach churn, but Thomas was right. I couldn't shield her forever. That evening, as I tucked Kathryn into bed, she looked up at me with her wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, who was that lady yesterday?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "She's someone from our past, sweetheart. Someone who used to be part of our lives but isn't anymore." "Why not?" Kathryn asked, her voice soft. I sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in mine. "Sometimes, people make choices that take them away from us," I said carefully. "But those choices don't change how much you're loved or how special you are." She seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Daddy." Her trust in me was both humbling and terrifying. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, my little star." A week passed without word from Eleonore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for the right moment to strike. I was constantly on edge, watching for any sign of her presence. Then, one afternoon, I received an email that stopped me cold. Subject: Kathryn. "Henry, I know you think I don't deserve another chance, and maybe I don't. But I can't stop thinking about her. I can't stop wondering if there's still a way to be part of her life. Please meet with me. Just once. No lawyers, no threats. Just you and me. Eleonore." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. I chose a public place, a quiet cafe downtown, and arrived early, hoping to gain some control over the situation. When Eleonore walked in, she looked as composed as ever, but there was something different about her, a weariness in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting across from me. I didn't respond immediately, instead studying her face for any sign of manipulation. "Say what you need to say." She sighed, folding her hands on the table. "I know I've made mistakes, Henry. I've been selfish. I've hurt you, and I've hurt Kathryn. But I've changed. I want to make amends." Her words rang hollow, like the practiced lines of an actress rehearsing her part. "You walked away from her," I said, my voice steady. "You gave her up without a fight. Why now? Why does she matter to you now?" Eleonore's eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something genuine. "Because I see what I lost. And I see what you've built with her. She's happy, and she's loved, and I can't help but wonder if there's still a place for me in her life." "There isn't," I said firmly. "You don't get to disrupt her world just because you feel guilty." Her face hardened, and I knew the moment of sincerity had passed. "You think you can keep me away forever?" "She's my daughter, Henry. She's my daughter," I shot back. "You might have given birth to her, but you've done nothing to earn the right to call yourself her mother." Eleonore stared at me, her jaw tightening. "This isn't over," she said finally, rising from her seat. "It is for us," I replied, watching as she walked away. That night, as I sat in Kathryn's room, watching her sleep, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Eleonore's return had stirred up old wounds, but it had also reminded me of something important. Kathryn's happiness was my only priority. And as long as I had her, nothing else mattered. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'll always protect you, my little star," I whispered. In the quiet of that moment, I realized that love isn't about who someone is on paper or in the past. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who fights for you every day. Eleonore might have been a storm in our lives, but Kathryn was my light, and I would never let that light be extinguished. As I closed her door and walked to my room, the weight of the past finally began to lift. Kathryn and I had weathered the storm, and now, we were free to build a future that was entirely our own. Together.